What if one of the most debated questions about Jesus reveals something far deeper than we've been taught? In this exploration, we uncover what really happened when Jesus encountered the Sabbath, and why his actions weren't about breaking the law, but restoring its meaning. Through tension, tradition, and truth. This story challenges how we understand obedience, revealing that what looks like contradiction may actually be clarity. Because this isn't just about what Jesus did. It's about what we may have misunderstood, and what that means for how we live today. The question that changes: how you see everything. This question has been debated quietly for generations, but rarely confronted directly. It sits at the intersection of law, tradition, and identity. And depending on how it's answered, it can reshape how we understand both Jesus and obedience itself. I remember the first time this question really unsettled me. Not because I had never heard it before, but because I had always assumed the answer was simple. Jesus followed the law. That was the foundation I had built my understanding on. So when I began to notice moments in the Gospels where he seemed to challenge what people believed about the Sabbath, it didn't feel like a small detail. It felt like something deeper was being exposed. Because the Sabbath was not just another command. It was central. It was woven into the identity of God's people. A sign of covenant. A rhythm of rest and remembrance that stretched all the way back to creation itself. To even suggest that someone might be stepping outside of that boundary would not have been seen as a minor issue. It would have been seen as serious, even dangerous. And yet again and again, we find ourselves standing in scenes where Jesus does something unexpected. He heals when others believe he should wait. He allows his disciples to do what some would consider work. He speaks with an authority that doesn't just interpret the law, but seems to reach beyond it. And in those moments, the tension becomes impossible to ignore. What was he actually doing? Was he breaking the Sabbath? Or was he revealing something about it that had been missed? That question doesn't just sit in the past. It reaches into the present. Because how we answer it shapes how we understand obedience today. It influences whether we see God's commands as rigid boundaries to be maintained, or as something deeper, something that carries purpose beyond surface-level compliance. There is a tendency to assume that conflict means contradiction, that if Jesus appeared to go against what people believed about the Sabbath, then he must have been rejecting it altogether. But what if the tension wasn't about rejection at all? What if it was about restoration? That idea begins to shift everything. Because restoration doesn't remove truth, it reveals it more clearly. And this is where the story becomes more personal than we might expect. Because it's easy to look back and analyze those moments from a distance, to see the religious leaders as rigid and Jesus as correcting them. But what happens when we realize that the same patterns can exist in us? That we can hold on to a version of obedience that feels right on the surface, while missing the very thing it was meant to point to. There is a moment in every person's journey where something familiar begins to feel incomplete. Not wrong, but not fully aligned either. A moment where the question is no longer about what we've been taught, but whether we've understood it correctly. And that's where this question begins to matter. Because if Jesus didn't break the Sabbath, then what he did in those moments wasn't rebellion. It was revelation. It was showing that something had been added, something had been misunderstood, something had slowly shifted over time, until what was being protected was no longer the original intent. And if that's true, then this isn't just about the Sabbath. It's about how easily something good can be reshaped into something restrictive without us even realizing it. It's about how tradition can become so familiar that it feels unquestionable. And it's about what happens when truth steps into that space and begins to challenge what has been accepted for generations. So the question remains, but now it carries more weight than it did before. Did Jesus break the Sabbath? Or did he reveal that we never fully understood it to begin with? What was the Sabbath really about? Before we can understand what Jesus was doing, we have to understand what the Sabbath was meant to be, not just in practice, but in purpose. Because the tension doesn't begin with his actions, it begins with how the command itself was being understood. There was a time when the Sabbath felt simple. Not easy, but clear. A day set apart. A rhythm built into life itself. Work would stop. Striving would pause, and for a moment, everything would return to a place of stillness. It wasn't just about rest. It was about remembering. Remembering who God is. Remembering who his people are. And remembering that life was never meant to be sustained by effort alone. But over time, something began to change. What started as a gift slowly became guarded. What was meant to bring life began to feel like something that needed to be protected from being broken. And in that process, layers were added. Definitions became more specific. Boundaries became more detailed. What counted as work was examined, debated, and expanded, until the simplicity of the command was surrounded by an entire system of interpretation. At first, it probably felt responsible, careful, even necessary. Because if something is sacred, shouldn't it be clearly defined? But there's a subtle shift that happens when protection turns into control. The focus begins to move away from the purpose of the command and toward the precision of keeping it. And once that shift takes place, something important is at risk of being lost. Not because the command has changed, but because the way it is being approached has. This is the world Jesus stepped into. A world where the Sabbath was still honored, but often in a way that emphasized restriction over restoration. Where the question had quietly changed from, "What does this day reveal about God?" to what is allowed and what is not. And that shift matters. Because when Jesus enters these moments, when he heals, when his disciples act, when he responds to criticism, he is not ignoring the Sabbath. He is confronting what it has become. There is a difference between breaking something and exposing what has been built around it. And if we're not careful, we can confuse the two. This is where one of the most important ideas begins to take shape. That obedience is not just about action, it is about alignment. It is possible to follow something outwardly while missing it inwardly, to maintain the structure while losing the substance. And that realization can be uncomfortable, because it raises a question that moves beyond the Sabbath itself. What if something can look right and still be incomplete? Jesus didn't approach the Sabbath as something fragile that needed to be preserved at all costs. He approached it as something living, something purposeful, something that pointed beyond itself. And in doing so, he began to reveal that the issue was never the command. It was the way it had been carried. There is a moment where this becomes clear, not through explanation, but through contrast. When someone is in need, and the response is hesitation because of what day it is. When restoration is possible, but delayed because of interpretation. That tension exposes something deeper than disagreement. It reveals a disconnect between intention and application. And that's where the weight of this begins to land. Because the Sabbath was never meant to prevent good. It was never meant to restrict compassion. It was never meant to create a situation where doing what is right becomes questionable because of timing. So when Jesus steps into those moments, he is not dismissing the Sabbath. He is restoring it to its original purpose. A day meant for life, a day meant for restoration, a day that reflects the heart of God, not just the boundaries of a rule. And once that becomes clear, the question begins to shift again. Not just what is allowed, but what was intended all along. when the Sabbath becomes a mirror. Now the focus shifts from what was happening to what it reveals. Because the moments where Jesus confronted the understanding of the Sabbath were never just about the day itself. They were about something deeper, something that still speaks directly into how we live today. There is something about the way these moments unfold that feels almost intentional in its timing. Not rushed, not accidental, but precise. Jesus doesn't just speak about the Sabbath. He steps into situations that force people to confront what they believe about it. And in doing so, he turns something familiar into something revealing. A man stands before him, his hand withered, his life shaped by limitation. The room is quiet, but not peaceful. There is tension, not because of what has happened, but because of what might happen. Everyone is watching, not out of curiosity, but out of calculation. They are waiting to see if Jesus will act. And if he does, whether that action will cross a line they have already drawn. And in that moment, the question is no longer hidden. What matters more, the condition of the man or the condition of the rule? That question doesn't stay in the room. It moves outward, beyond that moment, beyond that time, and into something much more personal. Because it reveals a pattern that is easy to overlook. The tendency to prioritize what feels structured over what is actually needed. To hold on to what is defined, even when it begins to stand in the way of what is right. Jesus doesn't avoid the tension. He steps directly into it. He asks a question, not to gather information, but to expose what is already there. A question that cuts through the layers of interpretation and brings everything back to something simple. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm? To save life or to destroy it? And suddenly the conversation shifts. Because the issue is no longer about what category an action falls into. It is about the nature of the action itself. About whether the Sabbath was ever meant to create a pause in compassion, or whether it was meant to reflect the very heart of God more clearly. And that's where the symbolism becomes impossible to ignore. The withered hand is not just a condition. It becomes a reflection. A picture of what happens when something that was meant to bring life becomes constrained. When movement is limited not because life is absent, but because something has been restricted over time. And when Jesus restores that hand, he is doing more than healing a man. He is restoring a picture of what the Sabbath was always meant to represent. Life, wholeness, restoration. Not restriction, not hesitation, not distance from what is good. There is another moment where the same pattern emerges. But this time it feels even more direct. The disciples are walking, and they begin to do something ordinary, something human. And yet even that becomes a point of accusation. Because when the lens is focused on rule over purpose, even the simplest actions can be misinterpreted. And again, the response is not defensive. It is revealing. Jesus points back not just to the law, but to the heart behind it. To moments in history where need was present and provision was made. Not because the law was being ignored, but because it was being understood correctly. That's the difference. Because when something is truly understood, it doesn't become less meaningful. It becomes more aligned. And this is where the Sabbath stops being just a command and starts becoming a mirror. A mirror that reflects how we approach what we believe. Do we see truth as something to protect or something to live? Do we hold on to structure because it feels safe? Or do we allow purpose to guide how it is expressed? Because the reality is, it is possible to preserve something so carefully that it loses the very thing that made it meaningful to begin with. And when that happens, restoration doesn't look like destruction. It looks like clarity. It looks like something being brought back to life. And that is exactly what Jesus was doing. Not breaking the Sabbath, but revealing what it had always been pointing to. Where this confronts us today. This is where the distance between the story and our lives disappears, because what was revealed in those moments didn't stay there. It carried forward, and it still shapes how we understand obedience. Truth and what it means to live in alignment today. There was a moment I didn't expect this to become personal. It had always felt like something to study, something to understand from a distance, a question rooted in history, in context, in a world far removed from the one I wake up in every day. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized something unsettling. This wasn't just about them, it was about us. Because the same shift that happened then, the movement from purpose to precision, from meaning to maintenance, is not locked in the past. It's a pattern that can quietly take shape anywhere, even in places where the intention is good, even in places where people genuinely want to get it right. That's what makes it so easy to miss. We don't wake up one day and decide to misunderstand something important. We build systems. We form habits. We define boundaries so that we can live consistently. And over time, those things begin to feel stable, reliable, even necessary. But stability can sometimes come at a cost if it replaces awareness. Because when something becomes familiar enough, we stop questioning it. And when we stop questioning, we stop noticing. There is a kind of obedience that feels right because it is consistent. It follows patterns. It respects structure. It avoids obvious mistakes. But consistency alone does not guarantee alignment. It is possible to be consistent and still be slightly off. And over time, even a small shift can create a noticeable distance. That's the part we don't always see, until something exposes it. In the same way Jesus stepped into those moments and revealed what had been overlooked. There are moments in our own lives where something interrupts the pattern, a situation where doing what is right doesn't fit neatly into what we've defined, a moment where compassion feels more urgent than structure, a decision where the question is no longer, is this allowed? But is this aligned? And those moments can feel uncomfortable, because they force us to move beyond surface-level understanding. They require us to engage with what something actually means, not just how it has been practiced. So the question begins to shift again. Not just what are we doing, but why are we doing it? That question has a way of cutting through assumptions. It brings clarity to things that have been operating quietly in the background. And sometimes it reveals that what we've been holding on to isn't wrong, but it isn't complete either. There is also a subtle fear that can exist beneath all of this. The fear of getting it wrong. The fear that if we loosen our grip on structure, everything will fall apart. And that fear can lead us to hold on to things more tightly than we should, not because they are fully understood, but because they feel safe. But safety is not the same as alignment. And this is where the example of Jesus becomes so important. Because he didn't move carelessly. He didn't ignore truth. He didn't dismiss what had been established. He moved with clarity, with purpose, with a deep understanding of what was actually intended. And that's what allowed him to act in ways that seemed controversial on the surface, but were completely aligned at their core. So what does that mean for us? It means that real alignment requires more than repetition. It requires awareness. It requires a willingness to examine what we believe and why we believe it. It requires the kind of honesty that is willing to ask difficult questions, not to dismantle truth, but to understand it more fully. Because the goal is not to move away from obedience, it is to move deeper into it. To a place where what we do is not just correct in form, but aligned in purpose. And when that begins to take shape, something shifts, not just in how we act, but in how we see, when understanding becomes alignment. Everything now comes to a point of decision, not just about what we believe, but how we respond to what has been revealed. Because once something becomes clear, it no longer remains theoretical. It becomes personal. There is a moment when a question stops being something we think about and becomes something we have to answer. Not out loud, not for anyone else, but internally. In the quiet space where what we believe begins to shape how we live. And this question, whether Jesus broke the Sabbath, does not stay confined to a single idea. It unfolds into something larger. Because if he didn't break it, then what he revealed wasn't a rejection of obedience. It was a correction of misunderstanding. A realignment of something that had slowly drifted away from its original purpose. That realization changes the weight of everything. Because it means the issue was never the command. It was the interpretation. The layers that had been added. The assumptions that had been accepted. The gradual shift from meaning to method that had gone unnoticed over time. And if that could happen then, it can happen now. That's the part that lingers. Not as a warning meant to create fear, but as an invitation to pay attention. To recognize that truth does not change, but our understanding of it can. And if we are not careful, we can become confident in something that feels right, while quietly moving out of alignment with what was intended. So the question begins to turn again. But now it is directed inward. Where might I be holding on to something that feels correct, but hasn't been fully examined? Where have I allowed familiarity to replace clarity? Where have I chosen structure over understanding, simply because it felt easier to maintain? Those questions are not meant to unsettle without purpose. They are meant to create awareness. Because awareness is what makes change possible. Not forced change. Not reactive change, but intentional alignment. And alignment doesn't happen all at once. It happens in moments. Moments where we choose to pause instead of react. Moments where we look deeper instead of assuming. Moments where we allow truth to shape our understanding, even if it challenges what we've always known. That's what we see in Jesus. Not someone who disregarded what was given, but someone who understood it completely. Someone who could step into tension without confusion. Because he was not bound by surface-level interpretation. He moved with clarity because he knew the purpose behind the command. And that clarity is what allowed him to restore what had been misunderstood. Not by tearing it down, but by revealing it more fully. So what does that leave us with? Not a new set of rules. Not a different system to follow, but a clearer understanding of what was always meant to guide us. That obedience is not just about what we do. It is about how closely what we do reflects the heart of what was intended. That truth is not fragile. It does not need to be protected by limitation. It needs to be understood in fullness. And that alignment is not found in avoiding questions, but in being willing to ask them honestly. So the question that began this journey remains. But now it carries something more than curiosity. Did Jesus break the Sabbath? Or did he reveal that true obedience was never about restriction, but about restoration? And if that's true, then the real question is no longer about what he did. It's about what we will do with what we now understand.